Welcome back to another amazing episode of Rage of Aquarius, the Outsider Astrology podcast. Today, we have a very special guest, an accomplished astrologer, published author, cultural commentator, Jessica Murray. Thank you so much for being here, Jessica.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we love having you on with us. Wanted to have this happen for a long time.
Fabulous.
I'm going to do a little bit of an intro for our listeners. I'm sure most of them are familiar with Jessica because she's had such a long career as a professional astrologer. And I would have to say is hands down the best geopolitical interpreter of or mirroring the astrological movements to what is happening down here on the planet. And
Wow, Frederick.
well, I do
That's
really,
quite an accolade. Bless your heart.
Before the show today, I was trying to think, I was like, God, how did I meet Jessica? And it was like one of those relationships that it's just seemed to always be there in my life. But I was like, well, no, there had to have been, a time when we actually met each other.
Right.
So if I recall it, I think it was obviously through email because I haven't met you in person yet.
Isn't that funny?
I know. But yeah, I like I was just saying about your skill set as an astrologer and the way that you work. I see it as you as an artist with the astrological matrix. And so to be more specific, Jessica's a professional astrologer from San Francisco. She has written 2 books, Soul Sick Nation, which is, to me, the best book I've ever read that delineates the United States birth chart and really gives the reader like granular looks at all the different facets that compose, the US psyche, and then how that is mirrored in the birth chart. And then her second book, At the Crossroads, was a collection of her writing from her Mother Sky blog website, which is at mothersky.com. And we'll have a link to that up in our notes on the podcast. And how would you describe At the Crossroads, Jessica? Was that the big grand square at the time?
Right. In fact, I would typify that whole era as the Cardinal Cross years.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember Uranus and Aries at that time and how it was making that seminal square to Pluto, which is really the biggest deal maybe in our lifetimes.
Right.
At least
right.
the baby boomers, certainly, because we're the ones who started. We came into our own under the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, and that was the next big deal from that cycle. But there was so much turmoil and action on the streets and in politics and culture during those years that At the Crossroads came out. And that's when I wanted to put it together and try to make some kind of astro sense out of it.
Right. Well, and you did. It's a knockout book. That's another one I'd recommend for the folks listening. So we're going to open up the dialogue today with, there's different things, Rachel and I were discussing before you signed into Zoom about looking at some of the obvious things related to the biggie Pluto moving into Aquarius, and then also trying to see or develop a better understanding of some of the mayhem having to do with NATO, Ukraine, also what's happening with Israel, Palestine. And then, it's like, this is like the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. And then we look to the US, having 2 kind of living mummies that are running, for president here. I guess, representing the last burps of the Pluto Capricorn transit.
Right.
So, oh, and then I also had mentioned to Rachel, maybe we could talk some about just where astrology is configured right now.
Right.
Pluto skirts into Aquarius, which is often a sign associated with astrologers and
Right.
So of those topics, like what did any one of those sort of like pique you, like right when I mentioned it?
Well, we're still straddling that threshold, aren't we, between Pluto and Capricorn and Pluto and Aquarius, so that the dissonance of that buzz, the tension of that milestone, the way it's going back and forth is really the topic that's permeating the airwaves. The fact that we aren't really yet in Pluto and Aquarius, and the world soul knows it. We're trying to make sense of the rubble that was the Pluto and Capricorn years.
Yes.
And I think that that's what we're supposed to do if we want to be finger on the pulse about this. Like you say, the old men running in this duopoly, this outdated system, electoral college and all the nonsense that's 250 years old and shouldn't be left unexamined here in 2024. All this is kind of indicative of the fact that we haven't really landed on the other side of that Pluto and Capricorn line.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, just to let the listeners know, in case they're not up on it, as Rachel had pointed out to me, or reminded me, Pluto moves back into 29 degrees of Capricorn, right at the election date in 2024. And then it's actually the sun on inauguration day is conjunct Pluto in Aquarius. And to me, that really when she pointed
says it all.
I mean, what do you make of that, you two?
Oh, well, I want to hear from Jessica, as a matter of fact, because when I looked at the astrology for this upcoming election season, I was kind of paralyzed with trepidation, and I don't normally like to allow fear to guide my interpretations. I don't think that's the correct use of astrology, but I have to say that the transits that we are experiencing in election season are like a tangle of thorns. And so I would love to hear your insights, Jessica, on that, particular time this year. It begins, September, when Pluto retrogrades back into Capricorn. And then by election day, just FYI for everybody who is interested in the details, our election day reveals an opposition between Mars in Cancer and Pluto at 29 degrees Capricorn.
Right.
So in some ways, there's like unfinished business from the Pluto return.
Right.
And that is a planetary war, if I've ever seen one. Mars in Cancer debilitated, which makes Mars a bit more dangerous in many ways. And then we have the Mars retrograde just a month later, December 6th, stationing retrograde in Leo. And then we will end 5. It looks to me like a lot of loose ends, a lot of unfinished business, a lot of unanswered questions. I don't see a satisfying conclusion or a satisfying victory for anyone.
Well, maybe not in our lifetimes, but
Yeah.
I think these are human responses to a situation. It almost is an honoring of the power of Pluto to realize that we quake a little bit when we see it opposed by Mars. But beyond beyond sort of clocking our initial fear of it, we can dip into our bag of tricks as astrologers and do something useful, I think, by copying the big picture view and look at it, take a few steps back, intellectually look at it from what we know about the cycles and what's trying to happen, rather than just merely staying in our human emotional responses to it, which is, of course, what most people are going to do. And I'm not faulting us for doing it either. It's part of the package of being human. But the wonderful thing about astrology is looking at, for example, the thing we were talking about earlier is what does it mean in the big picture that Pluto spent these years in Capricorn? What was it trying to break down? What's its job, essentially, on a collective level? And when it turns its attention to Aquarius, what's the job of this next 20 years going to be? And then we start sort of trying to take the pulse of bigger blocks of time. And it becomes so fascinating, which I think is the essence of Aquarius, is it fascination with the human drama. It becomes so fascinating that we start to look at the whole mess that way. In a way, I think this answers another question you answered a minute ago, which is how can astrology be of use in these fraught, panicked times? So we could pick it apart anywhere and it would be interesting. The Mars-Pluto opposition, wow. You know, drama, right? It does an exact opposition 3 times. First one is November 3rd. So it's telling, isn't it? You pointed this out, Frederick, about that last degree, that 29th degree, as being the place where it decided to make the first of 3 oppositions. Does it again on January 3rd, does it again in April of 25. So it's almost like, okay, let's look at that opposition in terms of 3 battles in a particular war. And already you feel a little bit of spaciousness around the issue. You keep looking at cycles instead of singular transits, which they never are. Transits are never isolated, are they? But we forget that when we look at like the transit picture for a given day, like a fraught day like this.
Right.
Are you with me here?
Yep.
Oh, yeah. I want to just add, like, just listening to you describe this or unpack it, like, I just felt the humility move within me about, you know, when you're forced or decide, which astrology affords those of us that work with it, it affords us that stepping back and sensing the bigger cycles that we won't even live, you know, to see. And and then it puts everything into this, you know, much more fascinating sort of matrix or perspective.
It becomes genuinely interesting.
Yes. And I'm reminded of the great work that like Dane Rudger did, because he was such a big proponent, like you were saying, Jessica, of, you know, there isn't just one aspect, it's part and parcel, you know, this whole cycle. You could say, you know, it started when they conjunct and then they move into opposition, and then, you know, and then it's constantly moving and going. And us as pipsqueak humans, you know, we're here kind of screaming about, you know, one particular facet of it. So yeah, that's my response to the point you're making there. Definitely.
There's also the issue of how, if you do look at a given day's transits as just a little piece of a cycle, you can start to see cosmic echoes better, such as the way that the Mars-Pluto opposition harkens back to the previous conjunction. You know, in 2020, Mars was conjunct Pluto. It was kind of the birth of the fake big steel propaganda campaign, and also the attempted actual big steel. You know, that was kind of given birth then was also a cosmic echo of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in 2020. Remember when that was a huge, big deal, when the big great mutation, it was called?
Yes.
And you start to see that, okay, we know what degree Pluto's at when it opposes Mars upcoming. It's going to show us, like you said earlier, the death throes of the US Pluto return. So it's definitely the end of a phase of that dying.
Mm.
So there are all these different ways of looking at it. That, go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, finish, Jessica, what you were saying.
No, that kind of wraps it up. I'm just thinking about, you can look at where it's been, where the
Right.
cycle has been, and what kind of strings of the cosmic harp it's tweaking. These strings have been there kind of in the collective unconscious, and the great divine finger is approaching it, making it sound again.
Yes.
That's what I mean by a cosmic echo. So you go, oh yeah, that Jupiter Saturn conjunction was at 0 degrees Aquarius. And what did that start, which was both a 20-year cycle and a 200-year cycle. So it's really impossible. It's so complex to talk about all of the ramifications, but you can pick out a few of the major cycles that a given transit is remembering, so to speak.
Yeah, remembering, calling back
to.
Yeah. I think it would be great for the listeners to have, like, it's almost impossible to do, but like a short primer on, because now that we're exiting it for the most part, the Pluto transit through Capricorn.
Definitely.
Like how it's, how did Einstein say it? Well, if you can't explain it to a 7-year-old, then you really shouldn't be trying to define something. Of course,
that's great.
But well, and you too, Rachel, like how do you two see, in a nutshell version, the Pluto through Capricorn transit? And again, I know you just can't take a single thing out of the whole and then, try to make a definitive statement on it. But anyway, I think you get my question.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Oh my goodness. So in a nutshell, well, my very simple breakdown of Pluto's influence is that it opens up a portal into the collective unconscious mind, and it dredges up what is repressed there, whether that is psychic or emotional. It also, as a result, dredges up the past and that condition that we all experience in our personal lives, where we unconsciously repeat patterns, oftentimes patterns that are quite unwanted, and yet we inherited them, or we unconsciously become locked into them, and we struggle to get out of those cycles and those patterns. And the only way to do so is to, as Carl Jung said, not to be cliche, but to make the unconscious conscious. And so the whole Plutonian influence is this alchemical transmutative it's this alchemical transmutative opening or opportunity that forces the individual as well as the collective to face the unconscious, face what is hidden in the darkness, face what is repressed, and hopefully bring it out into the light of consciousness, bring it out into the light of awareness. And that is the only way to make any positive shifts or any real change.
Because that's what it's for.
Right.
Its design is that. It's not just that we're trying to put lipstick on a pig here and find a way to suffer less. Right. But also look at it as, but that was Pluto's function.
Right.
And I think that it's good that we stress this with clients and with listeners, that Pluto doesn't kill anything off. It doesn't care. It's just, we use that language, of course, for dramatic emphasis, but the symbol of Pluto just refers to that point of transition between energy breaking down in one form and reconfiguring into another. It really isn't the planet of death so much as the planet of death/rebirth. And I don't think it's an accident that we don't have a word in English for that, because we don't understand it. So we put a lot of emphasis on the death part because death is sexier.
Yeah.
Titillates us because we're spooked by it. But essentially, it's the most organic process you can imagine. It's breakdown and renewal.
Yeah. Yes.
And like Rachel says, it's what is it breaking down in terms of the collective experience, which is mostly, I think, what we're talking about today.
Yep.
It's the stuff in society that has been a dirty secret, and like income disparity, which was, not part of the popular conversation, even though it was happening until Pluto and Capricorn in the house of money in the USA, right? Second house, Sibley chart, brought it out of the woodwork. Like Rachel said, it dragged it from the underground and made it visible. And it's not like Pluto made it happen. It's just that it exposed it.
Exactly. I always like to use the metaphor of an X-ray machine to describe Pluto's influence. Yeah.
Exactly.
And oh my goodness, I mean, like looking through any scientific instrument that reveals things beyond our normal perception can be fast. It could be
Yeah.
fascinating, very useful. We can diagnose, but it can also be truly horrifying.
Right. I think it's a good word for Pluto. Horror is different than terror, because terror is just extreme fright, but horror involves an element of repulsion. And the things that Pluto exposes tend to be extremely unsavory, vomit and feces and rot and decay, that we're revolted by at the same time we're afraid of. But then if you were a scientist, and this is the sign, Aquarius, this is one way to look at Pluto's going into Aquarius. It would give us the freedom from merely being paralyzed by our emotional reactivity to these disgusting things, and to view it the way we would hope real scientists do. Like somebody who studies things that, laymen would consider revolting material in the human body. This is what I think our challenge is here with this transit.
Yes, and looking back on the influence of this Plutonian, introspective, revealing and exposing energy in the sign of Capricorn, just for listeners who are not familiar with when that started, it was in January of 2008 that Pluto moved into the sign of Capricorn. So you can see that it's a very slow moving planet, and we have been chewing on this, metabolizing this since that time, since 2000. So
Yeah.
what has been revealed since then?
Right.
Lots.
Well, I just want to add quickly, like that, to the point that both of you have made about the it's sort of like the cat's out of the bag. It's a kind of, I guess, euphemistic way, especially looking at the sign Capricorn and what that revealed when Pluto's moved in there. The whole financial global, the destruction of the whole global financial realm that happened almost to the day that Pluto was in there. And then, and I've heard a lot of activists mention this as sort of the tipping point, was once the great hope of humankind, Barack Obama, stepped in and then, you know, incrementally bailed out all of the hedge fund managers, the
Yeah.
banks.
Mm-hmm.
No one was imprisoned. Nobody has suffered consequences, except for people like me that almost lost my home to
Yeah.
foreclosure. And were many millions that did. That really sort of cat out of the bag again.
That jolted people.
People were like, wow, this is really rotten to the core. And
It took something like that for a materialistic society like ours. Had to be
yes,
hit in the pocketbook, you know.
Mhm.
exactly.
But the
But then
Pluto in the second house, it really rectified that placement, didn't it?
totally, yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm.
I've had Pluto in my second house because I'm a Sagittarius rising, I guess, like the
Mm-hmm.
country I live in. Now, what's interesting, just from my own personal experience, I mean, I was born with Pluto in the 12th house, Scorpio, and so I've always been just naturally very, very, very much oriented towards questioning authority, looking underneath rocks, having very little regard for the surface level of the
Mm-hmm.
political narrative, if you will. I have long felt, my entire life, as a matter of fact, I've felt misrepresented and alienated from all, heads of state and all,
Mm-hmm.
all of the policies that are supposed to represent supposedly, the will of the people. And so the era of Pluto and Capricorn for me was, yes, there was a lot that was exposed and there was a lot that was revealed, but I felt in my own experience that it was kind of like being joined.
Vindicated.
I felt like, oh, there's people finally joining me in this lonely dark.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
and I've always been a little, well, I've known a lot before people that I would call my peers ever had any inclination to distrust something as simple as putting themselves on social media. I did not do that when social media first arrived. I did not get on social media because I saw clearly that this has the potential to invade our privacy, become a trap that any corrupt government can use against us as common people. It's a form of surveillance. It's a way for people to be tracked. It's a way for people to be also influenced through not just censorship in the way that we once understood it, which when I was growing up, you know, the most evocative anti-censorship lesson in elementary school was the Nazis burning books. And
Mm-hmm.
that was something that, as an American, you are just like heartbroken at the thought that these people were so zealous and so narrow-minded and so ideologically insane that they were burning books. And it's so anti-American. But I remember when the Kindle came out, the first thought that I had was, oh, well, they won't have to burn books now. They just don't put them on Kindle. Like, it's just that
Yeah.
simple. And
Power.
yeah, and you can make live updates to texts that are on Kindle. And so if something is published in one year, and it becomes something that is threatening to a specific ideology or specific institution of power, they can just go in and they can delete that section or they can change that section. And so the sort of mutability of digital libraries I saw
Mm-hmm.
as very dangerous. And by the way, I do use Kindle. I'm not saying that I don't use these things, but I've always been very cautious and very aware.
Well,
And
these are the kind of issues that Pluto and Aquarius is going to shove in our face.
hmm,
We don't have, we haven't figured out any of this. And
right.
we've got 20 years of Pluto and Aqua to even begin to ask the questions about what's going to happen in this age of where intellectual property is the new oil. IP is the new oil.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
yeah.
think a salvo was launched the other day when the stock reports came out on Meta, you know, Mark Zuckerberg's company. he had slashed, I don't know, a huge amount of the workforce in cutting back when it looks like the stocks were going down a year and a half ago.
Right.
And then it was announced he'd made, like, I don't know, within that quarter, $151 billion. It was literally touted as the most outrageously successful stock bump in the history of the market.
Mm-hmm.
But it was then pointed out the other side of the equation was brought up by, I forget this activist writer's name. He's a professor. He's always on with Kara Swisher on their podcast. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. But he was just pointing out the cost of destroying, children's minds that has been at the forefront of arguments about social media, their loss of self-esteem, narrative analysis, suicidal ideation, all of that goaded by Zuckerberg and his fervor to just dominate at all costs.
To
and of
dominate
course,
at
he's
all costs.
rewarded, massively. But then I just thought, what a 1-2 punch. Here's the, first of all, the bad news came out about the kids, but then it shifted the narrative to like, whoa, look at these box office numbers. Like, we're still back in our
capitalism, man,
hypnotized by these crazy ass numbers. And I really don't know anybody in my circle that's like benefiting from the stock market other than people that have all the money already and just keep buying, their stocks back, which is Facebook immediately did that like 2 days ago. Bought,
it's so
$55 billion of its stock back. I think there was something that when I revisited an interview I did with you, Jessica, during the big Uranus-Pluto square, and there was a quote that you had pointed out to me by Nathan Heller in, I think it was the New Yorker, talking about this bizarre tech corporate crazy growth that was happening. And the quote that you pointed out to me was he was saying the ambiguity is what's new in new corporatism. A company that wants to be the champion of arty, quirky individuation and also wants to grow toward enormous profits fits no widely held social worldview that we know of. That to me harkens into or leads into like Pluto and Aquarius.
We're going to have to face the issue of what capitalism is combined with AI. It's a combination that's the deadly fusion. It's about, we haven't faced this yet because AI is so new and so changing the world at such a breakneck speed that the human mind hasn't caught up with it. But I think these transits, thinking of the Great Mutation, previewing the Pluto and Aquarius years, which itself is previewing the Age of Aquarius, whose threshold we're sort of hovering over a whole 2000-year block of time. It's all about, the AI supercharged corporations destroying everything else. In pursuit, like you say, of shareholder value. And if that's not a very strange and counterintuitive approach to life on the planet, I don't know what is. That terrifying analogy that technophobes came up with of the paperclip machine that takes over the world in its single-minded pursuit of making paperclips because it's pre-programmed to make paperclips and can't be turned off.
It sounds like the Sorcerer's New Apprentice or something.
Yeah, it does. No, I've never heard of it.
It sounds like what?
The Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Exactly. So the writer Ted Chiang says capitalism is that machine that'll do whatever it takes to prevent us from turning it off. And so think we can really look at any of these dangers, these dystopian visions of the Aquarian period ahead, without considering that we've got kind of a life annihilating economic system that's doesn't make any sense anymore.
Of course, I on that note, I want to point something out that hit me the other day. I was reading something by Cory Doctorow, who's a kind of he's an activist that pushes back. I guess he's more kind of a Marxist, which of course people listening to us talk right now could be, well, they're talking about socialism and Marxism, But anyway, he was talking about the AI hysteria, as he calls it. And I just want to read this thing he said, because it really made me look at the more nefarious side of this transit related to AI. Anyway, he said, AI isn't going to do your job, but its narrative may convince your boss to fire you and replace you with a bot that can't do your job. Like what happened when Air Canada hired a chat bot to answer customer inquiries, and it started making shit up about bereavement discounts that the company later claimed it didn't have to honor. The story's been all over the news, he said, for the past couple of days, but so far, as I've seen, no one has pointed out the seemingly obvious inference that this chatbot probably ripped off lots of people.
Yeah.
The victim here was extraordinarily persistent, chasing a fucking refund for 10 weeks and then going to the regulators. This guy is a Six Sigma self-advocate, which implies a whole bell curve's worth of comparatively normal people who just ate the shit sandwich Air Canada fed them.
Right.
So there, I was thinking, wow, yeah, that's really what it's going to be about. Just worse customer relations from the corporations. Remember that old telephone motto? We're the phone company. We don't have to give a fuck. Like, more of that than ever. It's for like getting into AI realm. Like, oh my God.
That's what happens with Pluto. It pushes whatever sign it's in to an extreme in order to squeeze these dark impulses of, in this case, a collective, into the open, so that rot can be exposed to the air, and then natural law can take its place. The trouble is, when we talk about these horrors, which is really what they are, and on a societal level that we're going to have to cope with, is in the short term, it's a very unpleasant phase of the Pluto cycle. The phase where the ugliness is being pushed to the extreme.
Exposed,
It creates a lot of suffering. So I think that again, it goes back to the original point of that's in there, but it's not really the point. It's not really the thing to focus on, although how could we not, when we have incarnated into living our lives in this phase of the breakdown cycle. It's not to deny that. I think that we have to find our role in this phase.
Well, would you say taking like this example that he gave and say, I don't know, the compounded outrage that people have over something like this dealing with a corporation. I mean, do you see the upside of the Pluto Aquarius transit? I mean, not to get it into such a black and white polarity, but I will.
Well, it's a good question.
But do you see the upside as like people, that Aquarian spirit of, well, what the individual can't do by themselves, we can accomplish as a unified group?
Right.
You see that as, being the natural extension of like this kind of rage and being ripped off, and, that people, or are they like in love with the fucking machines?
Well, there's always going to be most people. We're not really talking about everybody being on the bandwagon of looking at the healthy cosmic purpose
thank you
of
for
a long
saying that,
transit like
because if you
this.
look at history from the beginning of time,
Right.
it's only been like a small sort of
Very
group of,
small.
yes.
But
And
that's all it ever takes. I mean, again, very big picture. It doesn't dismiss the suffering of most people on the planet.
Mhm.
It just, we're being realistic when we say, like you did about the bell curve, that there's always just been a few people at the outer edges who can, for example, conceive of the real meaning, the big picture meaning of Pluto, and who can even strip it from the bad good evaluations that we can't help as human beings to lay upon it. We're in the middle of it. Maybe Oppenheimer was an example when he could look at that A bomb and recognize it as archetypal death.
mm,
And the beauty of that movie, I guess, is, and of his whole approach, of his intelligence, was that he could bring to bear this, dare I say, spiritual understanding upon even a worldly horror. Now, then, if you look at that as kind of a big example, epic history book style example of this phenomenon, but there are little everyday examples, like being able to see in the short term that we relatively cosseted middle class Americans have to suffer these economic inconveniences, right? I mean, I'm just exaggerating for dramatic effect. That
yeah.
we can, I guess, if we can maintain the theoretical discipline to hold these difficulties in the same big picture way, that we won't freak out. We'll at least try to have a vantage point from which we can discern our own role in these dreadful circumstances by looking at our chart. I mean, that's my belief as an astrologer, that our own role in these chaotic times is spelled out in cosmic terms, in coded terms in our birth chart. And then, of course, we apply the transits to it and we go, oh, I see. So I have the potential to get this insight about these dreadful times this summer, and so on.
Right. I would just say for the listener, having corresponded with Jessica for years and read her mothersky.com site, the blog she does, a newsletter, that she is really a proponent of the notion that we're each born when we're born, because we're, you could say, predisposed to fit into the slot of time. That would that be a way to put that?
Yeah, that's right. We have an individual personality, style, identity, and we also have an identity as members of a certain generation and a certain era. But everybody has a different set of strong suits within that, and not everybody is karmically designed to write like Cory Doctorow or so on.
Yeah.
Exactly. And yet there's folks like him out there, and
there
Scott,
always will be.
And that's, I think, kind of the upside of
Right.
finding ways to maneuver this. I just want to bring up an interesting point to what I think both of you touched on here about, say, Pluto in the natal chart. That might be interesting to people, because I came across this by reluctantly doing an article on the pop singer Taylor Swift.
Reluctantly, but very interestingly.
I got fascinated by this bizarre, bonding of her and Trump in the national dialogue over the last month or so. It was kind of fucking just nuts. But so it was very interesting when I looked at her natal chart. I didn't have a time, so I don't have an ascendant. But from the moment her career took off, Pluto had exactly conjuncted by transit her sun in Sagittarius, and then progressed a lot, moved along and touched off her stellium. I think there's 4 planets in Capricorn. And with each pass, she, like grew and grew and grew and grew into just, this mega like presence within the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
And then what I thought was so interesting, as soon as Pluto went into Aquarius and landed on her Venus,
yeah,
all this pornographic material hit the internet that the bots had created, like Mid-Journey and these image making gizmos.
Right.
And it was the only time in the history of Twitter since Musk took over that he actually exercised some kind of like censorship, because he's supposedly the big free speech,
right.
bring the Nazis in, they can all be on here, everyone's having a party. But Taylor Swift had some nasty put out, and then boom, got, her legal team got in there and But anyway, what do you two make of the because I was saying in the post I wrote, like, shit, if I had a client coming to me and I was like, wow, okay, so the next 15 years you've got Pluto on your sun, all of your Capricorn planets, all, opposing your moon in Cancer, which is conjunct Jupiter. I would be like, wow, okay, I've got to do my homework on working with this client. I don't think I'd tell them they were going to be the next Taylor Swift if they were an artist.
Dave
I'm
Rudyer
curious
would
to hear
say
both of yours take on that.
Okay.
Rudyer would talk about certain individuals being singled out to be personifications of an outer planet transit, as if the divine mind had tapped them on the shoulder and said, you express this Plutonian mandate for your generation, or you become the voice of Uranus, the Promethean voice, and then your own ego structure, your sun and the inner planets become just fodder. They become subsumed by this collective urgency. And that not everybody, this is his view, is ordained to do that, obviously.
Right.
But it's very suggestive if you have a client like you just described, Frederick, who has these very pointed Pluto activity. It's clearly a potential for that. What do you think, Rachel?
Well, I completely agree. I mean, you kind of took the words out of my mouth in terms of some people being archetypal representatives, and someone like Taylor Swift. I guess I should be embarrassed that I don't know very much about her. I don't know a lot of details. I'm learning about Taylor Swift now, but it sounds like, Frederick, that you really have followed. So
well, he's embarrassed to be up on the details. You're embarrassed to be not up on them.
As a music lover, I'm not a fan of, she's no Joni Mitchell.
But she obviously represents something really essential. And, she is a fellow Pluto and Scorpio, like myself, like he's a little bit younger than me.
And her Mars is in Scorpio, just to put those two together.
Right. And I think she's a Scorpio ascendant. So it makes sense that she would be able to represent Pluto, the transpersonal archetype, for a generation, or even across generations, but for this time. And, as far as I know, Taylor Swift is the most famous person in the world right now, or something.
Her and Trump,
And that is, I think that's partly true. I think there's real, genuine devotion. I've seen it. I know how much people love her. On the same note, there's always the question of the ability to manipulate data and streaming and make appear as though there is
Right.
more attention than there is. And so,
Mm-hmm.
with Taylor Swift, I think she represents, like, genuinely as an artist, she taps into a pulse. She gives people catharsis in some way.
Yeah.
I know that people love her costume changes and they exalt how much she has shape shifted throughout her career, which, anyone that has a love for popular music with any historical sense knows that there's nothing new about that. That's David Bowie, that's Madonna, but
Mm-hmm.
Taylor Swift is doing that now for this generation. And I feel like,
Yeah.
yeah, and then the dark side is that, this young girl has been consumed by the machine. She is not, we don't know her as a person. We don't actually care. She's an object, which I think, Pluto on top of her Venus really describes that.
Mm-hmm.
Totally fine to just
Right.
exploit this young woman and to basically to say we love you and we wish to humiliate you all at the same time.
Exactly.
Well, and we wish to link you with Donald Trump. Like,
We want to adore you and destroy you, like we
Adore
did
you.
with John
yes.
Lennon.
And then
So
This is a
go ahead.
classic psychology of the collective. Go
Mhm.
ahead.
Well, yes, yeah, build them up, tear them down.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Plutonic sense, she has had an interesting trajectory, and we'll move on from her
Mm-hmm.
because I think this could get boring. But just in all this deep diving I was doing, it was so interesting to look at once Pluto hit
Yeah.
her Uranus, then she was melded to Crazy Town with Kanye West, who,
Right.
if you remember, usurped her, some award
Right.
she won, got up
The
there,
Grammys.
and that was melded in the collective. These two were then this sort of molecule swirling around one another that got crazy. And then this whole thing now, that what's really alarming about it in a novel way is it is possible that if Taylor Swift like rallied her, Swifties, that it
Yeah.
could actually impact, the election in
Right.
2024. So I'll just leave it at that. But it's interesting. There she is with probably the biggest shadow figure in the US, which would be Trump, and now, melded together in this
Yeah.
craziness like thing. Anyway, enough
It's
on
it's a
Taylor Swift.
very it's a very evocative demonstration of this principle that Jungian astrologers like Liz Green have laid out so eloquently, that a person can become their sun, sun, can be subsumed by the outer planets,
Mm,
like Hitler was when he
hmm
was just a dinky little wimp, and then he would walk up on stage and he became Neptune Pluto. He was what the ancients would have thought. Um, what's the word that you get an exorcism for? He became possessed by
Mhm.
these outer planet energies, and he lost the individuation faculty that would ideally balance us all out.
Mm.
So this is a statement about the power of I would say, the three outer planets to indicate the collective, the mass mind, where it's at. And Taylor Swift, that whole phenomenon you're describing with the similarities to Trump and the development and the raising her up in this weird fanatical adoration and then tearing her down, which is so classic with the whole phenomenon of fandom.
And
It's like a
yes,
beautiful demonstration of how that works.
For
And we
sure.
learn more about the insanity of the collective
Mm.
by watching what happens to these figureheads. I think that's what they're for.
interesting.
Sure, absolutely. I think that it's good to just kind of lay out that there is a narrative that's unfolding through these cycles. And during the time of Pluto and Capricorn, which we are not fully out of yet, we have all collectively been grappling with our darkest fears about institutions of power, hierarchical structures, and of course this includes entertainment, because the influence that these, great artistic machines, these, like, you could say that the Renaissance was a beautiful melding of the market, money, and art. There's
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing wrong, in my opinion, with money and art coming together, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel like if it wasn't obvious before, during Pluto and Capricorn, almost all of us have felt very cynical and rather betrayed about the arts, the movie industry, the music industry,
Mm-hmm.
outside of
Yeah.
politics, and of course they serve the political machine always, absolutely 100%. There's nothing new about that, but the real knowledge of that, and the real, like, the
Mm-hmm.
dry bread and water that we've been served for so long shows me that this kind of desperate love of Taylor Swift comes partly from deprivation.
Yeah.
Uh, and
Yeah.
what she represents to me is, I'm sure that she's lovely, and I don't mean any offense, because if you love Taylor Swift, I'm not trying to insult you, but there's no variety in the music industry right now. She's really the only drink of water in the desert, and there's something really lacking in the cultural fabric as a result of just the revelation that this institution of power, music, movies,
Mm-hmm.
they have revealed their hollow core. They're being
Right.
run by necessity. Necessity
Well,
has become an abstraction. Everything's run on the
mm-hmm.
and the statistics, and everything's
Right.
they're not even betting anymore. They don't take risks. They don't actually
Right.
want to play the game of life and creativity. They want to make predictable profits. And it's interesting that this evolution from Pluto and Capricorn, which is based upon the hierarchical structure, I said
Mm-hmm.
that, the idea of the 1% is a Pluto and Capricorn era.
Yes.
We never said that before. We never said the one.
No. Mm-mm.
And I think the
People
1%.
knew it, but they didn't voice it. It didn't become part of the public discussion.
Yeah, no, there was a very different sense of that in common conversation, common awareness. And, since 2008, average people have conceived of this, that there is
Yeah.
a pyramid and they are at the bottom. And the hopelessness in trying to scramble, because, you could say a ladder is something that might be frustrating to climb, but hey, it's just one hand up, one foot up at a time. A pyramid is something so Capricornian, it's crushing.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
Yeah, and it's
Made of stone, very permanent.
and we're not invited to climb. There's no invitation there. It's already set. It's a caste. It's a class caste system. And so it makes sense to me that, like, one of the most evocative symbols of that era was the eye at the top of the pyramid, which is of course
Yeah.
on the US dollar. So hey, but the deep dive into its meaning has become very important. That symbol is almost like the Plutonian portal into
Right.
understanding what the hell has been going on underneath the surface, or what's been going on while I've been in middle class bliss. And for me, I didn't, like, almost lose my home. I never have had the chance to have a home like millennials
Right.
experience. The door is shut, sorry. Like, there's no opportunity to rise, there's no opportunity to
Yeah,
uh,
but you grew up with the image that there was still that.
I
That's the interesting thing, that
I absolutely,
juxtaposition.
oh my God, yeah, it was extremely harsh. It was very painful because I was,
It,
as well as many of my peers, this is not just my story. We did everything right. We got our little jobs, we went to school, we got our degrees, and it was just, there's no there's no decent employment for you, period.
so
There's no,
different than the underclass in other countries who never had that fantasy, who
right,
were never
Right.
propagandized with that
right.
Well, that's
picture.
right. And that was the big, to me, which, because I didn't give my little nutshell version of Pluto and Capricorn, but to me, it was the death of the American dream. That
Mhm.
people that I can buy a house, just what Jessica was saying, weren't, raised with that. I mean, that really became the defining
Yeah.
of,
Mhm.
Pluto and Aquarius, Capricorn. But listen, I want to just check in with you two. Where do we want to shift or move or T-bone something, or
Well,
where?
I don't know how much time we have left.
6 or 7 hours, I thought we'd go. I'm kidding.
It's gonna take
That's
at
why I'm
least that
checking
long.
in to see where you two are, like, what do you feel? Is there other stuff itching to?
I would like to, just kind of describe the transition of consciousness, the collective consciousness and the
Right.
unconscious from that pyramid, that hard stone, that hierarchical structure that's
The
been
1%, yeah.
the 1%. How does that morph into
Right.
realm of Aquarius, and how is this of benefit, and also what are the great dangers? And I think we've touched on some of the dangers, but it's good to just really dig into what does this transitional time represent, what symbols or significant events even that have already occurred really represent the shapeshift or the transformation into Aquarius.
Yeah, I think I would love to hear Jessica's compilation of that, because I just wanted to interject that she had done this killer webinar on Tony Howard's Astrology University
Mhm.
on the Pluto Aquarius. And what the title of that was again, Jessica?
The crisis of being human.
Exactly. So it's I remember listening to that, and I recommend all the listeners here to go and do what you need to do to stream that over. We'll put that link up as
You can
well.
get it on my site too directly.
Okay. Okay, great. But all that research and deep diving you did, Jessica, what's the rule? Like what did
Right.
you know what I'm asking?
I think I always like to go back to demystify it by breaking down a huge, overwhelmingly complex transit with these myriad examples that get us so attached, at least they do for me, to break it down mechanistically.
Mhm.
That is, this is air. Pluto's moving from Earth to air, so we know it's going to be about ideas. We know that the Capricorn, like we've all said in one way or another, it was 15 years of pushing monetization to a crazy fixed extreme, to the point where it was so insane that nobody could deny it anymore. And this is a big takeaway of what we've all three been saying, is that Pluto makes something, the rot in something so obvious that you can't deny it anymore. So there's nowhere to go but up. you like the
Right.
atom bomb, which Pluto governs, which reduced everything to atoms.
Mm.
They have to be rebuilt from scratch. So if we want a positive note, let's back up and look at that.
Mm.
So Pluto revealed all these horrible truths about the institutions of power. Like you were saying, Rachel, they weren't new,
Mhm.
but it exposed them to the light. And I love it when denial is ruptured through. But so the scandalous or immoral or underground activity in the realm of Capricorn material is what we're looking at specifically. And that means the bones of a system. The Capricorn is the skeletal structure of a society. And they are those things which ironically are supposed to appear most permanent, the most cohesive, like governments, national borders. And it left all of these structures in chaos by discrediting them. Societies all over the world lost their bones like that, which, again, in case it doesn't go without saying, it left standing, Pluto left standing the ones that were still working. It only takes away what's already not viable.
Mhm.
But in the USA, it was especially obvious because here we are with the Pluto return. So after 250 years, Pluto and Capricorn in the house of money, plutocracy. Used to be that I would talk about plutocracy decades ago in my writings about the USA, and it was taboo. You couldn't use that word. You weren't supposed to admit. And now you hear it all over the place. So that it's as if the transit flushed out of hiding the corruptions of our economic system and the anachronistic structures like, you know, the integrity of the Supreme Court. Nobody believes in that anymore. The dignity of the Oval Office. I have a great memory for you. Do you remember when Trump was in England meeting with the Queen and he walked ahead of her, which was a huge breach of protocol? He like pushed his way to the front, which wasn't unusual for him, but it horrified the English. It was like a little microcosmic example of Pluto and Capricorn. I will spit on your old dignity of your old conventions. And we could say, oh, that's horrible. And we can, despise the whole thing. But it was so classic as a representation for what the whole 15 years was trying to do. Anyway, where are we now? Right?
I think
Go ahead.
I don't think that anyone should have to respect the Queen. So personally, that's
exactly. Well, it shows how relative it was.
The way Pluto.
Should we respect the electoral system? It's the same thing. It's just that these were used as glue. That was their meaning. Whatever the collective had decided was going to be cohesive. So traditions that you and I and Frederick would think were absurd, probably always thought we were absurd.
I mean, how do
but
we
they don't work anymore.
How do we see then, this, crippled, broken down, the old reliable ways kind of broken apart? Then, because we're talking cycles here. So now, okay, Pluto moves into Aquarius. Here's what like the ghost of Christmas past is being drugged, behind it. Is this rubble of, the old structure. And of course, we're getting, a couple more passes, Pluto back at 29 Capricorn. What, like, using our imagination, like what would be then in this shift into air?
Yeah.
With this, rubble being drug in, or maybe it won't be. I don't know. I mean, this is what blows my mind when I watch, like, I was watching something with Biden the other day. I mean, not to pick on him or whatever, because I'm not a fan of either gentleman, but like, I just was like, my God, this is like, this explains the fervor for all of these, like, Day of the Dead, zombie films that are just, the collective just gobbles this shit up.
Well, they know that we all know in our bones, because we're animals instinctively, that something is dying, something very big is dying.
Yes.
People freak out when an era dies. It's natural.
Well, and then here's our figureheads, I don't know. So there's just no denying the perfection of the cosmic thespians that set all of this up on the stage of reality. Like, and so I'm trying to like think, well, okay, Pluto's finally going to get there in Aquarius. We're out, like Jessica said, the air element that's been taken apart. Now, like,
well, the earth has been taken apart, right?
Well, that's what I mean. The earth element. So then into the air, and then do you see that as like all of these conflicting ideologies and theories, the whole mental?
What I see is that, first of all, let me throw out that how to respond to all this decay is what divides the sheep from the goats, in my view. You have to You have the reactionaries, people reacting against change, who want to go back to the way it was or the way they imagine it was, because it never was. And then you have the forward-looking folks who are responding rather than reacting, meaning paying attention to what's being revealed about the essential ingredients and the structures that are getting demolished. And I don't mean necessarily progressives in the political sense of the word, but in the USA, it would be, what is it, this admitting, this acknowledging look like? Admitting that certain structures of the government, like the Second Amendment, right to bear arms, and the Electoral College, which I keep coming back to, these things, just because they're so obvious that their origins were centuries ago, and they need to be updated. And those who are on the wave of the future, the waves that have their finger in the wind, to be paying attention to what's happening, what the cycles are telling us it's time for, will have their ears perked for creative ways to update these structures. Because like we know with the atom bomb, atoms are going to come together again in some form. It's natural law. We don't have to worry about that happening. It's just, are they going to come together in more imaginative ways? Or, the reactionaries are never going to be the ones for the source for those visions, because they're going against natural law. They want to go backwards. I see some of the examples of things that need to be updated that are so baked into popular culture that we have always held them as assumptions, like our notions of class, which are left over from the Industrial Revolution, if you think about it. The origins of the terms working class, this is 19th century. This is Marx. And, middle class, what does it mean in the information age? And the symbols of power, this is Pluto going into Aquarius. It's going to demand a new vocabulary for what even power means. Like we were saying, intellectual property is replacing the old form of valuing a resource, which was what? Gold, spice, money, salt.
Yes, data is now the new oil.
Data is the new gold. So these things, I believe, will happen naturally. I mean, if you believe that as above, so below, you see this is happening without us having to figure it out. But that when we see creative thinkers, healthy, positive, balanced minds coming up with responses, not reactions, to these new collective urgencies, then we hitch our bag into that star. Like, Frederick and Rachel and I all have, I'm sure, our favorite writers and thinkers who are genuinely integrated people whose visions really seem life affirming, who are addressing issues like AI and quantum computing and these new Aquarian.
The problem is they're couched as being, communists or.
But that's always the way it is.
I guess
with every new era.
Because, like, if you read, like, say, I'm very agnostic politically. Both sides annoy me tremendously, just as a disclaimer. But I do tend to go for writers like Chris Hedges or, Glenn Greenwald, Aaron Mate, people, that are all now considered like puppets of Putin. And I'm just like,
well, for a while, but the truth will out. This is just a very temporary.
You say that. I do hope that's true.
You never underestimate the momentum of the powers of reaction. This is not surprising in all eras of human history. There's an enormous culture lag between what time it is now and the freak out reactions that accrue to the loss and the panic of the time it used to be. So I don't think that we can use the way that the mob is finger pointing at these thinkers as any kind of measure of whether we should listen to them.
Well, the problem is where the internet is basically everybody's mode.
Yes.
Because like just yesterday, like Matt Taibbi showed how the State Department is, contacting advertisers that would put money on different websites that disseminate
Right.
information, and they have a blacklist. And of
Right.
course, it's all, you know, Chris Hedges, Aaron Mott.
Definitely.
Yeah, and so those people get strangled out for whatever
Right.
money.
It's happening. Look at
It's,
Navalny in Russia. I mean,
I
it's an
was just
extreme
going to bring
example
him
of the
up.
same thing.
And right on the heels of the Tucker Carlson interview, I thought, wow, Putin's really making a fucking statement.
You ever ask yourself, in the midst of all this, these justifyingly horrifying scenarios, do you ever ask yourself, what will the history books remember? Or beyond that, who will, you know, if there were some alien race centuries in the future, who will they think of as heroic?
Right. What's the new Handmaid's Tale book going to be? That, you know, how that story was written, where that's archaeologists find this woman's note.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I don't know, Jessica. I mean,
well, I'm asking it as a rhetorical question to show that if we grade the horribleness of what's happening now in bigger picture terms, we will probably want to be on the right side of history rather than get completely tangled with the reactions that are happening in our current little cultural moment. I'm not saying don't read the news, not at all. I get very impatient with spiritual seekers who shut that out, but not have it be 90% of our focus.
What would you say a good way to divvy up the focus would be?
Well, as astrologers, we look at cycles. Let me go back to the numbers. I mean, that's all astrology is, really, right? Geometry. And the way we get our meaning of how things are unfolding is by looking at, for example, the Uranus-Pluto conjunction that started. It's going to turn into, and then it was a square, and all the shit started to hit the fan, you know, with social media. And, you know, Snowden actually released his files. You were talking, Rachel, about the eye at the top of the pyramid. He was talking more about government being the big brother. Now we're talking about the government and the corporations, which have merged, right? Saturn and Pluto conjoined, and they're seamless. Now they're all the same thing. But anyway, we look at that as happening under when Uranus and Pluto squared each other. That was the next phase. Now they're going to start to trine. It'll be exact, you know, when they're in Aquarius and Gemini. And if we see this as the next step in the cycle that began with that infamous Virgo conjunction in the 60s, we can see it's about power, which is Pluto, technology, which is Virgo, and inventiveness, which is Uranus. And I'm just encouraging us to remember that astrology looks at themes. So we can think of that 60s theme, and whatever they were, they're being developed. They're being developed by the incidents of the square 2012 to 2015. And now we've got this Aquarian emphasis, which is science. So they've mutated, they've morphed. That same crazy conjunction is now getting into this level of science, which is new inventions and new theories. You were talking about this, Frederick, or old theories being disproven. Which, by the way, don't you love the way the Big Bang is now being questioned because of the James Webb telescope?
Right.
These are huge destabilizing findings that the old ideas about space-time do not fit. And the AI, nobody has to be an astrologer to see that, you know, the new Uranus-Pluto development is going to be having to ask questions about that, because now it's too new to have any spiritual or moral even intelligence applied to it. It's just all too new. It's just all, oh, these little boys who have a new toy, excitement about that, and they haven't matured to the point of accruing an understanding of the implications of it. So that's going to be the work ahead for us all.
I feel like this is a very liberating time, although there's many things to be very cautious about, and certainly even there's fear, and I suffer from that too. However, the way that I see, at least in my experience, and I have taken note that it seems to be in the collective as well, that divide between the 1% and everyone else that happened during Pluto and Capricorn is not just the experience of being crushed under the heel of someone's boot. It is, in fact, a separation between the common people and the elites. There is no more loyalty to these people and their ideologies, and their vision of the future is just a story. Their exaltation of AI is just a religious fervor. And that's not to say that we should underestimate the power of AI, but in
Right.
other ways I say, yes, you should, because the ideology they're peddling is that that AI is smarter than humans, which
Right.
is an idiotic statement because what does smarter mean?
Totally.
And also
Exactly.
silly.
Exactly.
And this is their God, and it's not my God, and it's fine if you want to have that, but we don't have to share their religion, nor
Well,
do
we
we,
dare not. I
and
mean,
we
we're
don't
we're
have to,
toast if we do.
yeah, we don't have to support their wars. And this is something that I feel like started in the 60s for sure, but there was still mainstream, it was still a fringe thing, a marginalized thing, a youth to be anti-war. And I feel like at this point, it's beyond war. It is just an absolute condition that you do not have to support any of the agendas that these people are creating and inflicting. You don't have to support a war just because you're told to. And you don't have to sign your name on any ballot or any bill that you don't really care about. You don't have to give the power of your word to things that do not represent you. And this is something that really does recall the last Pluto and Capricorn to Aquarius transition,
Yes, right.
most notably the American Revolution. And, the astrologer Michael Luton, he came up with my favorite insight about the presence of Pluto and Capricorn in the US chart, because the United States is maybe the only country that I know of that was elected with astrology. Its birth was elected by
Right.
Franklin. And so,
Exactly.
yeah, it's very
There were probably others, but I take your point.
yeah, I mean, I don't know of any.
We
That's
don't know of any.
exactly. And so when you look at the United States chart, it's not like your birth, which was definitely divinely orchestrated in some way, but also a surprise to your mother and father. Did not know exactly when a child is going to be born, and that's part of the joy. But the United States was born at a very deliberate time, well chosen. However, the founding fathers of the United States were not aware of Pluto. It wasn't discovered until 1930. And they did not see Pluto in that elected chart. And the way that Michael Luton looked at this, which I just love, is that he saw this as the totally unconscious shadow, completely and
So
totally.
interesting.
And what that represented in the United States was the unconscious shadow of the empire that it broke from. And becoming aware of that shadow has been the journey from 1776 to this point we're in right now. And the United States, having experienced the Pluto return, has been so painful because it's been a once and for all. You must accept that you've become the monster that you once fought. You have become the evil empire that you once accused the British of being. That and the similarity between, this is something that I noticed because he published this book years ago. When Joe Biden was elected, at the time that the US Pluto return was going to begin, the exact return, I should say, I saw it as beautifully symbolic because it was Mad King George, syphilitic, completely feeble in body, mind, and spirit, that
Right.
was at the helm of the British Empire when the revolution started.
Right.
He represented the rot and decay of that imperial. And here we are, representing We've become our mother. It's a horrific,
Well,
horrific.
you know that the Jungian concept of what is it?
Dromia.
Yes, where the opposites flip into each other.
Yeah.
So that's exactly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It is horrifying and truly, like, the reason why, I mean, I watched the interview with Putin, and I'm extremely against war. It's just my stance. I do not support war. I support self-defense, of course. I'm not a pacifist in the way that I expect you to die if someone attacks you, but I never, ever, ever make excuses for war. I'm heartbroken to look at the numbers of Ukrainians that have died. But I listened to the interview because I really did want to know, what's his story, honestly. What is his story? What is his justification and reasoning for this? And it was jarring to me because though I disapprove and disagree, and I can barely even conceive of the loss and the mayhem and the murder that has been going down for the last 2 years in Ukraine. I was looking at Putin and trying to feel that sense of othering, that you're the most evil person in the world. I wanted to feel that easy way out. Like, here's the worst person in the
Right.
world, our mortal enemy. Isn't it great that we're such good people and he's so evil? And it's impossible to do.
Mhm.
Why it was so dangerous for the mainstream media. It was dangerous because the reality is that the United States is worse. It's worse.
Mhm.
Not saying he's good by default. I'm not saying
No.
I'm not saying that we're evil and he's good. I'm saying that you can't feel the same polarization when you look at someone like Putin in this age in America, because we are the bad guys. We are the ones that have been spreading mass murder, mayhem, and absolute imperial devastation across the world with impunity and no regrets. And one thing I loved about what Putin shared is that he broke down like how stupid and arrogant and impulsive
Yeah.
our supposed top strategists are.
Right.
It reminded me once again that yes, there's the separation. The 1%, they're not smarter than the average person. They're not better. They no longer represent that aristocratic loftiness. Their
Mhm.
clothes, their clothes are more expensive, but they're just as ugly. Their religion is supposedly superior because it's been sanitized of the cosmos, traditional wisdom, and God, but they do not impress me with their religious fervor. I don't feel that the situation that we're in right now is going to continue to unfold the way that the quote unquote 1% would like, because the US Pluto return will be over by the end of 2024. And that era of Pluto and Aquarius has this quality of, yes, technology, certainly, intellectual fervor, ideas, and technological advancement. However, and what I loved about your talk, which I listened to in detail, Jessica, was that you did really center it around what it means to be human and what it actually is, it means to be human as the most important tenet and the most important meditation of Aquarius, the sign of Aquarius, which is the only other sign aside from Virgo that uses the image of a human.
Mhm.
And I really connect with that. The maiden in the field of wheat
Mhm.
and the water bearer, these human figures. And I've always thought, Virgo's the servant of humanity, but Aquarius is the servant of the gods or the ancestors or all time
Mm.
and eternity, however you want to look at it. And to me, what I'm excited about is that this separation from the 1% and this disgust and contempt for the corruption and the sickness in these people, the warlords and the war criminals is who I'm referring to, not just from the United States, across the world, those that coalesce around these values. That separation is going to be ultimately a great benefit because they're not meditating on things that are actually important, in my opinion. They're so obsessed with science that has been sanitized of all common decency. They've been usurped mentally and emotionally by their religious fervor, living forever inside of a digital cloud, having robot servants, replacing all human activities with simulated experience. These things are not going to ultimately show strength. And so to me, the
Mhm.
calling in Aquarius is to return to the real understanding of what it means to be human, which will weave in. It will weave
That's
in the past. It will weave in traditional wisdom. It's going to dip into the past, not to be anachronistic, not to just put on Civil War reenactments. I don't mean that. I mean like a genuine deep dive into ancestral wisdom, which I always say like our solution, our remedy for artificial intelligence is ancestral intelligence, AI. And to me, that's the real gift that's going to be flourishing, perhaps still at the edges. I'm not saying that we are not going to be struggling with the herd mentality, the Borg, the conformist attitudes that seem to be destroying all free thought. But at the same time, there's that revelation like, how much of the mob that hates Glenn Greenwald is real and how much is a bot war? How much of the public opinion that actually criticizes free speech and anti-censorship and somebody as awesome as Glenn Greenwald, who was a hero at the beginning of Pluto and Capricorn, now supposedly being an untouchable? I mean, it's ridiculous. And I feel like the percentage of people that really care, really feel that way about Glenn Greenwald is much smaller than what is presented. And that's one of the most important things to remember. Being human is so much more than being influenced by technology and AI. And being human is going to be the most essential survival skill, I think, in this upcoming era. And just one last thing, I mean, the word human, originally it comes from Proto-Indo-European roots. And, you know, the Latin word homo comes from, or humanus. They all relate to the idea of being of the earth. So it's like earthling or earth being.
Mhm.
But then that man is related to the Sanskrit Manu, who was the divine progenitor of humanity. And in Sanskrit, that root actually means to think. And so the word human itself means a being of earth who thinks.
Very interesting.
beautiful. And I think that's a great spot to wrap this for us.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Wonderfully articulated, Rachel.
Thank you.
I had no idea that etymology of the word human.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I
I just
add
found that
one,
out.
I want to add one interesting footnote to what you made about Aquarius as a human figure in the zodiac and then Virgo. One of the things I discovered when I did my fabulous Taylor Swift piece
Mm.
was how Regulus, the fixed star that you could say was always associated with the 1%, the royalty,
Yeah.
Mm.
has now progressed. It's at 1 degree Virgo now for the
No.
next 2000 something years.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
Yeah, so
Hmm.
that's a nice kind of 1-2 octave, harmonious octave resonance or whatever between Aquarius and this new phase,
Mhm.
this particular star that
Yeah.
has for so many years always been associated with, you know, those that ruled royalty,
Mm.
pomp,
Mhm.
the 1%. And here we
Mm.
are in Virgo. Hey, I want to thank Jessica Murray
Oh,
for
you're so
joining
welcome.
us. Jessica, any closing uh, thoughts or, you know, revelations?
I think that we can, we'll all be thinking about the Pluto and Aquarius issues going forward. And we'll have a lot of time to revisit them, all the
Mm,
things that are going to become flashpoints
mm,
that have to do with that sign, the beauty, the beautiful potentials and the hideous distortions of it both.
yeah. And
Mm.
I love the whole, you know, theme of the question, the inquiry, what is it what is it to be human?
Yeah.
I think, as I was listening to Rachel, I just was like, God, I mean, we've gotten so fucking distanced because of all of the technological, dazzlement, and everyone's got their phone, and that they're constantly like merged with the mechanical. And now it's time for the human to that the
To figure out
water,
what it is.
the human to step forth out of this rubble.
Yes, 100%.
Wow.
A machine cannot think. A machine cannot think. It can process information. It can draw upon a tremendous amount of data. It can aggregate content. It can summarize. It can calculate. But the whole premise that a machine can think is false. And that's something that I believe is important to remember the more that we get into this upcoming era, where we're going to be constantly inundated with this idea that not only can machines think, but they can think better than you. And that there's something insignificant about you. In fact, you're a part of a subspecies now. This is not true.
Right.
And I really believe that. I believe that's objectively not true.
Yes.
So remember that, everyone. You're a human being. Your ability to think is not the same as what your computer does. It's a beautiful thing that humans created computers because they can think, but the computer can't think. And you can never, ever, ever replace the artistic spirit, the creative spirit. These things will return humanity again to that former understanding, that traditional cosmic understanding of what we're doing here and what is truly dignified and special about being human. That doesn't mean that it's one-sided, all positive thinking. Obviously, humanity is flawed. The human condition is full of agony, but to lose the dignity of the human being, to lose the dignity of the individual, I mean, that's where we're at. And I don't think that it has strength to keep going this way. And I do see a tremendous flowering of awareness of what it really means to be human, which means that there is divinity in you and you can interpret that however you want,
Right.
however you want.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Okay, my friends.
Thank you again. Everyone, check out mothersky.com, which is Jessica's site.
Yeah.
And again, really appreciate you being here with us on Rage of Aquarius.
It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a beautiful day.
You too.
God us
Bye-bye.
bless.
Bye.